the only warrant they ever brought up for this, for why their definition is better, is that ours is vague. But that by itself is not, in fact, a warrant for giving their definition, saying their definition is better. Our definition is from the government discussing federal policy, and since we're talking about federal policy, we should be using the definition the federal government has laid down. And the other point here is that just because our definition of broad is broad, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's vague. It doesn't mean that you can't have anything that's not foreign aid. So foreign aid is just a good or a service that we're giving to another country in order to help them. That is essentially what our plan boils down to. It's a tangible or intangible thing that we give to another country to help them. So with that pointed out, let's look on to what the negative team has actually argued. They've argued that we're not changing aid, but again, as we said, we are changing aid because we're changing the current law. In the current system, there is a mandate that keeps people from having it, that forces people to do something. In the system we're proposing, that mandate goes away. By definition, we are making a change. And we spent the entire round showing how that's putting this into an improved form or condition. And may I point out, Judge, that they never contested that definition of reform, to put or change into an improved form or condition. So if we're changing this part of foreign aid and we are making a change in legislation, that means that we're changing the law, which means it's a reform. And may I also point out, I'll talk about this later, but we've had experts up here that we've quoted that said if we pass this law, we will end up feeding 9 million more people. Because as we said, everyone wants this law. NGOs are lobbying for it, USAID wants it, everyone does. So people want it to be passed and they'll make use of the option. So then let's move on to the second voting issue, which is evidence. Now, the negative team has tried to argue that by introducing food into other countries, we will create long-term dependency. However, when I asked the negative speaker in cross-examination for a single example of that, he could not provide one. And that's very odd since we've been providing food aid for a long time at this point, and he should be able to find at least one example if that is in fact the case. And I'd also like to point out the only actual example that's been brought up in this whole round is the pilot program, which granted, it was on a small scale, but they've given no reason to assume that would be any worse than what we talked about. And since it's the only example that's been brought up so far, that's the example we should be basing our reasoning on, especially since there shouldn't be any problem finding other examples if the harms they're talking about actually will come about. And then to go on to this other point regarding actually no, I'll move on because I'll talk about that in a minute. The next point they talked about is solvency. It's their third voting issue. The problem with solvency, they talked about how you will ultimately, as I said, end up creating dependency. However, the entire point of giving food aid is to give food to people that don't currently have food, which means they can't provide for themselves. So they have to be dependent on someone or starve. It's a choice between those two things. Now, I'm not saying either of those things is good, but the entire point of this is to feed people who need to depend on someone because they can't provide for themselves. So yes, dependency occurs necessarily, but if they don't get to depend on anyone and they starve. And that was basically their whole solvency argument, besides the fact that NGOs won't necessarily implement these reforms. Again, if you have a limited budget, like every organization on the planet does, you're going to choose the most cost-effective option, which we've showed over and over again, is local and regional sourcing and not using monetization. Then to move on lastly to their disadvantages in our fourth voting issue. Their main disadvantage has had to do with the fact that we'll end up distorting the economy and raising prices for whatever country we end up sourcing this from. Now, I'm not going to necessarily challenge that because it's a moot point, because that happens to the U.S. if we do it here. It's a point that occurs either way. If we source it from the U.S., we're taking food from the U.S. and selling it and using it in other countries. If we source it from some other country, we're doing the exact same thing there. So it's a moot point because that occurs either way. And since the negative team isn't proposing a counterplan to get rid of food aid, the harm still exists in either case. It just, all we're changing is which country it occurs in. And since we're talking about countries that actually have the resources to provide our food aid, we can assume these are countries that are wealthy enough that their economy can afford to have to be distorted, have prices raised to some extent, as evidenced by the fact that the U.S. is not currently experiencing a massive food shortage, but should be the case since we've been providing food aid for this long according to the negative team. So for all those reasons, Judge, because we've been on topicality, because their evidence has no examples and we do, because they have failed to effectively show solvency, and because their disadvantages have no link to the status quo, I would urge